Hallo Freunde, guten Tag. Ist 10 Uhr, mehr oder weniger, in Redmond und ist die Zeit für .NET API Review. Uh, in an amazing state of affairs, we appear to have no blocking issues, and I don't think that has anything to do with me trying to use Emo's dark mode for the API review site. Um, a bit of technical information. I'm done streaming from the laptop. This is a new desktop. It's a new desktop, so things like audio may not be set up right. So please point out any technical issues that you think you are seeing, and I will try to address them. And yeah, so with that, I guess we will get started on a discussion item related to issue 81500 about UTF-8 span formattable. So, Tanner.
Yeah, so we reviewed and approved this, and as part of that, we reviewed the initial set of primitive types that should implement the interfaces. However, I did not explicitly call out whether those interfaces should be implicitly or explicitly implemented. My intent was that they would be implicitly implemented. That way, they would serve as a viable replacement for UTF-8 formatter and UTF-8 parser for the common cases, and so that users could use them effectively equivalently to the existing UTF-16 formatting and parsing APIs. That is, you can just do byte dot parse and then pass in the UTF-8 read-only span of bytes, and everything just works. No need to define helper methods or do weird casting, or in the case of span parsable, which exposes static abstracts, no need to declare helper methods that are themselves constrained, etc. But since I didn't explicitly call out whether they were implicit or explicit, I just implicitly had the expectation. We understood what I was implying. We didn't formally approve which way they should be. So we should just go ahead and confirm that no one has any issues with them being implicitly implemented and therefore part of the public API surface.
I mean, on the one hand, I don't like the proliferation of the UTF-8 stuff, but I think for me the easy answer is whatever we did with the span format and span parse, we would do the same with the UTF-8 span format and parse.
Yeah.
So if there were types that we made it explicit because it didn't make sense, then we would be explicit there, and otherwise we would be implicit.
Right, and I think I think character is the only type where that might differ from the other types.
Right, because I feel like there's at least one that it was the span parsable and span formattable were explicit because they would be weird on the type. It may have just been char, but my gut reaction is just match the explicitness of the UTF-16 span variants. Does anyone want to voice a different opinion than that?
It's fine by me. Can't remember if any of them are that we're implementing it on are explicit, but if they are, we can certainly match.
Yeah, it does look like characters. The one case where we implement iformattable directly, but parsable and span parsable are both implemented explicitly for character. And I believe that was done just because parsing is effectively just validation that the length is 1 and then returning index 0.
All right. That seems to me to have covered what we just said. So
What does it mean in terms of API changes then?
It just means that all the same types are implementing all the same interfaces, but you will be able to do just byte.parse and then pass in the read-only span of bytes. You don't have to, for example, cast the byte to IUTF-8 span formattable first.
the the practical difference is what we talked about was the shape of an interface, and the ref CSs are going to edit for types to add new visible members on them as a consequence of the interface.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just whether the methods are public or not on the type.
Gotcha. And why did we do it on char explicitly? Because the API didn't make sense, or
Char's always been a bit weird because it's a single character, and we have public versions that take string, but the ones that take span are explicit. And I believe we discussed and decided at the time that was the right decision, just because of how trivial the implementation was, and it's a very uncommon pattern.
I see. So it's not that the API is bad; it's just not that useful to warrant polluting the API space.
Right.
Yeah, ironically, it's a little more useful with UTF-8 since it's not just target sub-0 equals char, because it could be multiple characters or multiple bytes rather.
Yeah.
But I think it's fine to just leave it as explicit.
Yeah.
All
Okay,
right,
so the one on the screen, I've marked this API ready for review not because I'm pushing for it, because I want to get general opinion on whether it's worth adding. And if people think it's worth adding, then this is the shape it would be. We have parallel.4 each. In .NET 6 or 7, around there, we added a parallel.4 each async, which is sort of async in two capacities. One, there are overloads that accept an IAsync enumerable, so it's consuming asynchronously from the source, and the delegate that you give it returns a value task, so it's sort of an asynchronous processing of each element. We did not add one for parallel 4, so there's no parallel.4 async, and we've had a few requests for the equivalent for parallel.4. Here, there's no asynchronous source, like we're not enumerating an IAsync enumerable, but you still have the potential for doing asynchronous work for handling the body. Now it's trivial to express in terms of parallel for each. It's just parallel for each enumerable.range, from in length. We can implement it a little bit more efficiently than that. But it's really about, do we want to expose this and make it easier to express for people that want to do this? I have no problems with it, just more surface area.
And we don't do the flavors with T-local because we don't think it's worthwhile, or it's just because it's yet another set of 4 methods?
For the same reason we didn't do it for parallel.for each async. It's very specialized, and it's very relatively rarely used. And when you're dealing, it's primarily about reducing overheads when the work that you're doing is so little that you care about, the costs of, and so you want to be able to do this sort of per task isolation of data to aggregate and then do a final aggregation. But when you're dealing with asynchrony and you're dealing with things that are generally taking longer and more expensive, the benefits are diminished. So we just haven't bothered, and we haven't, for parallel.for each async, we haven't heard a peep about the lack of those. And so I would suggest, we wouldn't do that here either.
And then the only reason you have more methods is because of cancellation token overloads, right?
This should be the same number of methods that are on parallel for each async. Basically 3 per source. One that takes a func, one that takes a cancellation token, and one that takes a parallel options, which also includes the cancellation token. And then it's, are you taking int or long? Oh, you're comparing to parallel 4? Is that what you're comparing?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying.
There's no parallel 4 that takes a cancellation token, as you were saying, because it's part of the parallel options. And when we discussed this for parallel for each, there was a desire to bump that up to being a first-class citizen, so that you don't have to create the parallel options for that super common desire. So that was just copied here. Functionally, this would behave semantically identically to parallel for each async enumerable.range, from and like.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have any problems with it. It makes sense. I mean, to be honest, I have not used parallel 4 in a long time. So,
yeah, I mean, there's been a renewed interest in the parallel class in particular because of for each async, because it provides a natural way of launching a whole bunch of concurrent operations. I think that's why we're seeing these requests coming through again.
And
I mean, it is convenient for compute bound work, right? It makes sense.
So the T-local variants of 4, and maybe for each, those are to avoid the capture that's inherent in this, right?
Not exactly.
Because here in their example, which is weird because I don't think their list type actually has a thing called generate thumbnail, but
yeah,
they have a list outside. They're passing in an index. Now they need to read off the list, but you have to capture the list.
There's nothing in any of the existing or proposed APIs, synchronous or asynchronous, for avoiding capture if your delegate wants to capture other state. I think it's T local or something that's on the existing APIs. There are overloads that take an initialization delegate and a finalization delegate, and basically for every task under the covers that parallel 4 creates, it will basically invoke that initialization delegate and then thread the result of that call through to each delegate that it invokes on that thread, and then invoke the finally delegate in that task. So it basically allows you to have the equivalent of thread local state, but it's more task local state, so that you can do aggregations or things like that without having to do cross-thread synchronization. Imagine you were summing every element in a million element list, right? You could have an interlocked add as part of every operation, but then every operation is synchronizing with every other operation running in parallel. If instead you had, 8 workers, each of which maintained its own sum for the values that it processed, then at the end of the operation, it could do a single interlocked add with its own sum. And so you'd only synchronize once per worker rather than once per element. Those overloads provided a way to do that by basically saying initialize the aggregated value, add to it, and then store it back at the end.
Fair enough. I was looking and just saw that the T local is passed into the func. So.
Yeah, your facial reaction, Jeremy, as to confusion at what I just described is a good reason not to have them here.
Sure.
Approved by facial expression.
I mean, it would probably make more sense looking at real code instead of what I had at the time was func of int and loop state and tlocal and really I was looking at why do we give the tlocal twice, and this violates the func rules because it uses the same type twice, and but then didn't see why it would know it's time to do the interlocked, and so Okay, if people are generally happy with the parallel for requiring capture, which, as far as I know, Steve, you're the person who hates capture the most, so uh, I don't
Yeah,
I don't
I,
see a very specific reason to add this, but I don't see a reason to not add it either. The for each seems more useful than the for to me.
the for each is more useful. It is, and it's also the general workhorse on which you can build for async if you want to. Like I said, I'm sort of ambivalent. I don't have any strong reason against it. It's not a huge amount of code. If people would find it useful or there for completeness, it's fine. There's also a trivial workaround that's not as efficient but close.
Do we
I
think
mean-
we're doing a disservice of doing value task and only doing value task here? Like, I can say we know we're going to call a wait internally, and so we're going to use it safely, but if somebody has an existing thing.
We're going to consume it safely. By far, the majority situation is you're just using async. And so you don't even see value task showing up. It's just that's what the compiler will end up producing. And if you happen to not be doing that and your body was just calling something that returned task, yeah, you'd have to say new value task around it, and then you'd be done. But if we had multiple overloads here, one that returned value task and one that returned task, that would result in ambiguities.
Okay, so you wouldn't be able to do a local lambda because we don't have a preference.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember exactly. This is trying to page stuff back, and we went round and round and round on that. I would have to double check. I'm pretty sure we landed in a place where that would fail to compile because of ambiguities. There was discussion about adding. There had been a request to add. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it results in ambiguities, and if not, the compiler would definitely pick the one we didn't want it to pick.
Why is there no implicit conversion from task to value task?
In large part for this reason. If we added an implicit conversion from task to value task, then there are situations where, given the option, the compiler will end up preferring task instead.
Oh, Jesus. That's the inverse problem.
Rosie, don't reach into an open computer case. Spinning fans are bad for cats.
Compiler I'm trying to remember exactly. I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, but the compiler factors in implicit conversions as part of overload resolution, and it picks the thing that is more convertible, I think it is.
Yeah. It basically has rules like, if this is convertible to that and that is not convertible to that, then the other one is considered more specific, right? It's the... Yeah, I can see that. Well, we also have no extension method, right? .as value task or anything like that?
No, it's just new value task.
Yeah, we probably should do that, because I guess if you just convert to value task, a non-generic one, it's probably fine, but as soon as you have a generic one, it's kind of a pain in the ass, right? Because now you have to repeat the type again.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of this, it wouldn't really help, because if you're calling an existing function and you try and pass just the method group name in here and you return task, it wouldn't work. And then the way that you would fix it would be to add something that converts it one to the other. And if you just do the async invoke the method, or async parameters to await the method, then now that'll be value task and everything will be fine.
Yeah, the amount of code is almost the same, right?
Right. So, like, in this case, it wouldn't help because the way you'd have to write the composition of it. In other cases, if it comes up, we could always add it.
I mean, I would assume most of the time you have an actual body. I don't think you have method groups that often for these cases.
No, it's very rare. I mean, it's very rare to just have it be a non-async method where you're calling, some task returning method. and the workaround in that situation is trivial. Just new value task, blah.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with the method. I mean, like, to me, it's not like looking at this provided sample code. It's like, I don't know, like if you replace it with for each async and then you have a enumerable.range, it's almost the same, right? Like if you squint in terms of number of characters being used on that line, it's not getting substantially more readable or substantially more expressible, right? But there's also nothing wrong with it. I think I kind of like the idea of having symmetry between for and for each. Seems also desirable. I would say like I would just approve it and call it good.
Yep. And approve doesn't mean that Steve ever gets around to implementing it.
I probably will go do it. Just because it's one less thing hanging over me and it's so trivial.
That's so funny.
All right. Add target host name to quick connection 60508.
Given that nobody's here from networking, we might want to skip this one. Unless somebody feels, I don't know whether Steven has context on this one, but, or we just, okay, that's super easy. Maybe we could just say yes.
I assume ... is get set.
I would think it's, I think it's just
a get.
Yeah, I don't think you would ever have a set on this one.
Okay, because I don't know if this is the input type or the output type.
Yeah, to be honest, I have not used Quick at all, so I would not know. But let's just look at the other APIs on that thing. I think they all get. So I would assume this is the same thing. Yeah, I think this is get only. Anything else makes no sense.
Okay, well, if they're just wanting to give details on their connection, that seems fine.
We should just make sure when we approve it that we approve it with get, and then make an explicit point of saying if you want set. I mean, I guess set is also fine. I mean, I don't think we really care, right? It just seems odd that everything else is get. And I don't think you get to construct one. You get a connection back, right? So yeah, I don't think set makes sense. I need to find a different way to render not null types. I don't like the changes I did, but I also didn't like the exclamation mark. I just don't know.
Why don't you just put at the top of the thing pound nullable enable?
Yeah, see, that's not that easy because the problem is that the way I store the syntax is I store it at every level. So when you look at an API, it's actually concatenated for the actual outline. So I would have to store somehow on a per API basis whether it had nullable annotations. Or I have to somehow magically extract that. But then it also falls apart when somebody does anything tricky, right? Because I mean, in principle, you can actually say like some of my arguments are not nullable, are nullable enabled, and other ones are nullable disable, right? So it is a bit of a weird thing.
I mean, I guess if you write your signature on multiple lines, you could pound nullable disable, then write 3 parameters and then turn it back on.
I mean, we have at least one API where we do that, right? It's enumerable.current, where we go out of our way to say, we don't say what nullability the current property has.
Fair enough, but it's uniform across the whole method. But I guess you can't know that.
Yeah, exactly. So like, I mean, I could make that change, but then as soon as somebody does something tricky, then I will get a bug report. But I guess now it's ugly as fuck, so maybe I should just fix that portion first. But I don't know. It's just, yeah, I don't know. There's no winning here. Another option is just when you hover over it, do something smart, but I don't know.
Okay, make some system net security members public for quick. This one is
A read-only property, okay. Is that really a thing? I don't think that's a thing, right?
I assume they changed the field to a public field and then went, oh no, it should be a property.
the thing for structs, not for class.
Well, there's also read-only modifier for methods, right? So I thought maybe that applies to the actual getter that is emitted, but I assume you would have to put the read-only modifier on the getter then, not on the property.
If it was a struct, I would think it would go on the word, or that it would be read-only get.
Yeah.
But really, if you just did it as get semicolon, it'll be read-only anyway.
Yeah. Well, if you do an auto property, yeah. But I mean, that's just the way we write APIs.
Right. Well, get semicolon can only be set in the constructor, so the compiler would call the member read-only on a struct, unless Andy wants to say that there's a subtlety for the thing that we're not even discussing. We're just talking about being confused by this word here. I just saw Andy and thought I'd acknowledge him.
I totally missed the conversation. Sorry.
Oh, we were just being like, oh, if this was a struct, where would the read-only actually go in a property declaration like this? And I think the answer is because it's get semicolon, it would go nowhere because it would already be a read-only property.
Right.
Yeah, but that's assuming that it's actually implemented as an auto property. So I think
that's what I
listing
meant.
it there, I think listing it there is better. Just to be explicit, and if you happen to be able to drop it because of the compiler
Yeah, well, it is a class,
emit.
so it doesn't actually make sense at all. This is clearly just they changed a field into public, and then went, oh no, it should be a property instead. I don't know. I feel like changing the internal constructor of the client hello to the public constructor means we might want to ask them questions, but if everybody wants to just say like these look reasonable, we can just hit approve.
We just take a look at what they currently have.
I don't know that we've often used read-only memory as a read-only collection, but I have no problem with it if no one else does.
Have we exposed public properties that return read-only memory so far? I thought we generally preferred to return spans and have the memory be an implementation detail.
No. Spans as a property is a no-no.
Because
I wrote it in the book. It's because the ownership of it needs to be clear.
But the compiler automatically tracks ownership, and that's what scoped and unscoped are for.
Yeah, I mean it's possible that the
Technically,
addition
that's not true.
Yeah, with the addition, we may need to revisit the guideline.
It tracks that your lifetimes do not go out of bounds, but C# does not track ownership.
Okay, that's fair.
I would like it to. I actually have a proposal for this.
Right, but it's the things of like, if you read the span property, which is now you have the local of the span property, and then you call dispose on the object, what is the state of that span? And so we have the general like.
How is that different from?
Well, if it's span in and span out, then sure. And if it's in this case, the read-only memory is they're just wrapping a local array, so disposing the object didn't do anything.
Well, it could have. If disposing the object cleared the contents of the array.
Yeah, and then it would update your local array, but you're not necessarily now writing into something that was returned to the array pool or doing another out-of-bounds memory.
You could be. They could have returned the array to the array pool that read-only memory was wrapping.
Fair enough.
Yeah. It's ultimately similar to like you can steal the backing array from a list by passing in a collection where the copy to caches the array that was passed in. So therefore, you can do very evil and fun things for performance that way.
Bad Tanner.
So are they just using this as a collection? I mean, if it's a collection, why the heck are we doing a read-only memory? It seems weird.
Well, I think that this is simply that they want to pass to or from, I guess this would be, that Quick needs to read this state, and you had a collection of intermediate certificates, and they don't want you from the context to go replacing this, so they don't want to give you an array that you could modify. So they want to read only array. Is my guess.
I mean, I get that, but like it's just an odd choice. I mean, we generally don't. I mean, I've never seen somebody using read-only memory as a wrapper around an array to have a read-only collection. Like that is, I think, something we've never done. Normally, we do this as a read-only memory of bytes or something, right? But like as a buffer. Like I think the more appropriate type is either literally read-only collection or some derivative, or we just give up and return the array, or we just return something like, I don't know, frozen array we don't have, right? But like something to that extent, right? I think using a read-only memory to represent a collection seems like I mean, technically, I guess, but.
Okay. I mean, we can certainly bounce this back as we're unsure about this point and need a discussion.
Also, they call it intermediate certificates, but then the constructor takes additional certificates. Is that the same thing, or is it a different thing?
My recollection is in this type, it took a bunch of stuff as input, it built the chain, and intermediate certificates are the ones that were actually relevant to the chain. And
gotcha. So it's literally just computed by the constructor, but it's not an argument that it's
right.
Just returned. And they can't return it as a certificate collection? Because that also exists as a type, I suppose.
They could. It's back to, I think they're trying to say A, not allocating, and B, not being subject to mutation.
I mean, it really begs the question, like, if they really just want to read only array, like, why not use immutable array? Pretty sure that's in their closure already. Maybe not. Probably not, actually. But we should have a super. I mean, this is, I think, a thing we should probably think about. Like, we should have an answer that is super simple. Like, you have an array, you want not to allocate, and you want to return a read-only snapshot of that, right? And if the answer is, oh, we don't want to use immutable array because of reasons, then we should fix that somehow. Because we should have an answer for this. Like, this should be a branded, simple way to do.
Is there one in particular you care about, Andy?
Yes, the event source API.
Yes. Proposed by you. So we'll go ahead and jump ahead, because I think he's the only one who's not a regular attendee. So add overload for event source primitives 83751. Andy.
Yeah, so a brief description here. So event source has actually quite a complicated API, but the fundamental thing is that there are two types of event source that are used. There's what's called manifest-based event source and self-describing event source. The difference between them is that it's actually quite subtle. The manifest-based event source is everything in the event source class that's called write event, and the self-describing is everything called write. And the write event stuff ends up putting attributes. You declare an attribute, or sorry, you use an attribute, put an attribute on the methods that you define in your override of event source, and those become like the events that are fired. And the way that you fire the events is that you call write event in the base class. Here's the problem. So we want to have event source support in AOT. There is one overload of the event source manifest-based events API that takes an object array. And that's the like catch-all var args thing. Then there are a bunch of other overloads that take int, two ints, int string, string int, going on and on. The problem is that the object array one is not trim safe because you can stuff anything in there, and basically what event source does is it serializes the input to the stream. If, however, the thing that you're passing in is a primitive type, well, primitive types are always rooted for obvious reasons, and therefore, as long as it's a primitive type, you're fine. You can always serialize those things without a problem, and trimming doesn't care, and everybody's happy. So the task is to find a way to like narrow the scope of those overloads such that we can create one overload that only takes primitive types, and that overload is preferred over the object array one. Because in my actual experience trying to annotate people's stuff, the vast majority of the time where people are using these overloads, they actually aren't passing complex types. And don't like take me 100% here, but I'm pretty sure that complex types are not actually supported. That is, you pass it in and it seems like things work, but I get a big error message in the debugger if I have a debugger attached saying like, this thing is not supported and your event will not fire. So I haven't actually tested it through event pipe or ETW, but my suspicion is complex types don't work. But anyway, the point is we want to prefer things over the varargs overload such that when most people pass these varying primitive types, they always go through a thing that only supports primitive types. And as long as the thing that only supports primitive types exists, it doesn't have to be marked trim unsafe. And therefore people's code isn't trim unsafe. And therefore they don't have to suppress any warnings. And yeah, that's good. Also, right now, the varargs thing is marked with a warning message that says, by the way, if you're only passing primitive types to this, you can suppress the warning, which is even worse because like not only do you get a warning, but we're suggesting that you can, in your infinite wisdom, do the thing that we like suggest that you never do, which is suppress the warning. So the goal of this API is to both get rid of the warning and get rid of people suppressing the warning.
Two questions.
Yeah.
First, have David and Noah and basically owners of event source weighed in on this? And the second question is, why is this limited to just the type shown on the screen rather than all primitives?
Great questions. So one, yeah, David and Noah have weighed in. They haven't re-weighed in. So the alternatives, like making the trimmer smarter, just don't really work because the problem is that the problem is too far away from the API. That like the problem is that there's a bunch of unannotated reflection, or sorry, unanalyzable reflection deeper in the event source API, and that's the thing the trimmer doesn't like. And then there are these APIs that through 3 levels of indirection call that API, and so there's no way at the trimmer's point of view, there's no way to like propagate the information that these are just primitive types all the way down. And in fact, like for the object varargs case, sure, the event provider might not fire or whatever, but you can pass in things that will get wrong answers because the trimmer will run and give you a wrong answer there. So like that API is truly unsafe, and no making the trimmer smarter kind of will necessarily help there. So I did mention to David that he should comment on this again, but hasn't gotten around to it. So I'm fine like waiting for them to, we can do like a tentative discussion here, and then like if they have concerns I can address them, but I hope that this is a good middle path.
Yeah, as part of that, I also love their them confirming or refuting your suspicions around more complex types working or not working.
Agreed 100%. And this was something I discovered over the weekend. So yeah, there's just not, I don't think there's been enough time for them to weigh in on that one. And then your second question, which is, why have I limited it to bool, byte, short, int, long string, as opposed to There are two things.
S byte, U short, U long, int pointer, uint pointer.
Yeah. So a number of those are not CLS compliant, and I didn't know whether we cared about that. That's the simple answer. There are also two ones that you didn't mention that are supported in event source, and those are datetime and GUID. I think those could be included as well, but I wasn't so sure about that. In fact, when I found uses in the runtime of passing datetime and GUID to the object array and then suppressing the warning saying this is trim safe. I'm not totally 100% certain that they are trim safe. So I left that for further experimentation. My idea here is that it would not be a problem to add more overloads later, but maybe I'm missing something.
I mean, my preference would be, like, if we're going to define something called event source primitive, then it should be capable of representing every primitive that event source understands. And if there's a subset that for some reason aren't trim compatible, then look at other options like annotating those implicit operators as what fires the trim warning. So if you happen to bind to one of those, that's what would cause the trimmer to send up red flags rather than using the right event overload that takes the params array or something along those lines.
That, I think, makes sense, although that doesn't feel a lot better than the object overload.
Well, it means that today any use of the object one results in a trimmer warning, and it says suppress this if it's unsafe. By putting it on this thing instead, you only get the warning if it's actually
true.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense to me.
And trimming aside, like having a single type to represent all possible primitives that event source supports, such that you can have a params of all possible primitives events, like that makes sense to me, regardless of trimming. And I'm a little concerned about sacrificing that ideal for trimming. So if we could find a way to have our cake and eat it too, that'd be good.
So that sounds good. There is one thing that I didn't mention, which is the actual implementation I have for this is pretty inefficient. It does boxing and copying, and I think allocates another array. You could imagine an efficient version of this, I think. One that holds on.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would assume a fairly efficient version of this would end up basically being a reference field for the string possibility, and then 16 bytes or whatever the largest type you support is, and some sort of discriminator to allow us to interpret it.
Some sort of discriminated union, if you will.
Yeah. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, when this gets written out, if I remember correctly, in event source, it is just translated to bytes. We end up basically, pinning or whatever and copying the bytes, and so it should be fairly efficient to transfer that representation.
Correct. That was my idea too, and so there was a secondary thing here, which is that you could imagine this API, in theory, kind of replacing the varargs one, because the varargs one is explicitly like, it boxes everything, so it's super inefficient. And there's a there's a doc comment saying like, don't use this for anything you care, like don't use this for any frequent events that fire because it's really inefficient. Define your own if you want to like have a fast path. This will always be a little bit slow path because of the params array. I mean, maybe that'll change with param span, but I don't know. Basically, that was one of the other reasons that I didn't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of like what things can event source take, because in theory there could be things that event source could accept that would not fit into the fast path form here. Maybe it would require a second object field or something like that. or more boxing or something, and I wanted to like leave open the possibility that this version could be fast and there could be an even slower version. You know.
I'll
So,
ask the practical question here. I assume you being from the compiler team, you know that this will work, but I can't say I've ever seen two params things as an overload in the same method group. What's the resolution order here? Why does this win when it has to go through an implicit conversion? Sorry, a user-defined implicit conversion.
The user-defined implicit conversion is preferred to a boxing conversion.
But string would still prefer to go to object and the object array, but the value types would prefer the UDC over the boxing, right?
But I think a variant reference conversion is also less preferred than an implicit conversion of the exact type. I can go check on that though.
Okay, but in general, if you're doing like string, you are going to hit a special overload anyway. It's only when you're going to do like string and int, and then you're going to hit the object.
The intent is so the intent is that this should be actually.
Yeah, I'm just making sure that by defining it this way and the way that it's proposed, we actually expect that it will win in the cases that it should work.
I think it should win in all cases. Like that is
okay.
My specific claim here is that for all of the values in that list, this should win in any combination, except for one of the ones where there's an explicit exact type match overload that already exists. If we to step back, like as not an event source expert, just from a C# perspective, I would have kind of preferred this approach as opposed to the like 4 different overloads of int string int. There's no bool overload, so if you pass a bool, you're going to end up in the var args no matter what. So there's like a pretty rough performance degradation here. If we could make this fast, it actually feels like an overall API improvement. But that's kind of just theoretical.
But so you think, so 3 strings is special, 4 strings is not. So currently 4 strings is object array, or the params object array, and you think that 4 strings would become the event source primitive array.
I think that 4 strings would map to this. Yes.
Yeah.
I think that there's it's preferred over the variant conversion.
I did just confirm that on SharpLab.
Thank you, Tanner. I thought that UDC's only won against compile failures, but apparently I'm wrong.
There is one thing to note here in that exposing this other params overload is technically a breaking change, in that if the user passed an event ID with no other parameters, then it will be ambiguous between the 2 params overloads.
Isn't there an overload for just event ID? There is.
Yep.
Okay,
so that one will always be preferred.
Okay. I missed that one in the huge list of...
I totally agree. That's why I was like, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we could use this for everything?
I think they're sorted by arity, so it's at the top of the list.
Yeah, I see it now. What about Stephen listed some of the other types that event source supports for integers, but what about float and double?
Yeah, for those who are on chat, like you can see where we end up in this in event provider, and you can see the list of types that it's special casing it's trying to cast object to. Float and double are in that list.
Is this something I should bother opening to the share, Steve?
Sure, it's on source.net, so there's nothing problematic.
Yeah, just the
and my
digging through.
My goal here was like to find, basically to make the places that I found safe, because I wasn't super confident about the long-term direction, but I agree that, you know, it would be nice if we could just put everything in here. And so, yeah, that seems like a good thing for David and Noah to weigh in on. Like, hey, is this how you want to go?
Yeah, it basically looks like it's all primitive types, like all runtime primitives. So that includes the integers, the floats, bool, char,
and then GUID and date time.
And
and
decimal.
byte array. Yeah, decimal and byte array as well.
Is decimal something that already does normally expected things with the trimming?
So that's kind of where I was going with the whole, like, I'm not exactly
I guess that
sure
just goes
how
back
trim
to
safe this is. Yeah, so like in general, datetime, GUID, basically composite structures could in theory end up in tricky places, but I suspect that they're fine. Like my answer is in practice, I bet they're totally fine, but I'm not sure why. I would have to backfill reasoning there.
Yeah, I mean, basically looking at the implementation of this, it could be that the constructor of all these implicit conversions could just be doing this exact work, basically, of interpret it as a void star and just blit it into the same whatever the biggest size thing here is, which I think is going to be GUID/long. So
yeah, right. The fast path, the fast path I would imagine would be you would take in the thing, you would look at the size, you would allocate you would stack alloc an event data star of that size, and then you would just walk the array and split those things directly into the event data pointer, and then fire it.
Well, because the interesting thing about that from where we're discussing all the trim stuff here, this is a cast to fall, which I assume does annoying things to the trimmer. But if it moves all these operations into the conversion and takes them out of here, then now the code to handle decimal is only read if you use the decimal. So this actually seems like it would be double useful for the trimmer.
Yes, it would trim it away. Not that decimal is going anywhere, but like, yeah.
I mean, does the average console app root decimal?
I suspect that it's rooted through basically another version of this. That there's so many like methods that are just switches on all the primitive types in corelib. There's got to be another one that's going to keep
pretty
it.
sure iConvertible roots it.
I bet, if nothing else, I bet generic math somehow managed to root it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Generic math has create, truncating, saturating, and checked, which basically are just type checks over all the other primitive, all the other built-in primitive types that implement the generic math interfaces. Conversions are not fun to do.
So high level, I think the concept makes a lot of sense. I think it'd be good to circle back around and revise based on the goal of representing everything that is actually understood by event source, making sure we can do it efficiently, and I guess confirming that we could either that everything would already be rooted or that we could mark as requires on reference code just the implicit operators that are relevant.
So I think that's fair. One thing I do want to bring up though is so part of the reason I'm doing this is because diagnostics as a team is like really strained. They have a lot of stuff on their plate for .NET 8, and when making third-party code trimmable, like this is probably the most common thing that I've seen, where not only do they get a warning, but that warning they often end up suppressing that warning, and like both of those feel kind of bad to me.
I'm not disagreeing, but just representing the types that you have on the screen doesn't actually prevent the problems that you just said, because the moment someone includes one of the other supported types, they will fall back to the object overload and they'll have all the exact same problems.
Agreed. It's from my perspective, it's kind of a spectrum where, like, if I could hit just, I mean, this eliminated, if you look in the diff, one of the big changes in the diff is there's just a bunch of suppressions that get removed, but not all the suppressions. Like, there are people hitting datetime and GUID in the runtime that still hit datetime and GUID. So I am happy to go back and do that, but I am a little bit worried about time constraints in terms of, like, if we try to build the maximalist version of this in .NET 8, I'm worried that it won't get through, and then we'll end up with more trimming problems that we don't particularly like.
What do you think?
Is there a middle ground?
I guess I'm not clear on the difference between what's on the screen and what we've talked about. Seems fairly small to me. What is the time constraint, in fact, that you're talking about?
If we wanted to make the version fast, basically, if we wanted to say, hey, this is our preferred mechanism for, right now, it's just all boxing. There's no fancy stuff. It still goes through all that code that you link to in the runtime. And therefore, I'm not really worried about breaking changes or anything because, well, it goes through the same code paths. But if we tried to actually make this like the preferred mechanism, then I'd be worried about, okay, we have to be really careful that the actual payload that comes out from ETW and event pipe and event listener is the exact same payload as came through the object array thing.
I think we need to be concerned about, but we need to be concerned about that regardless of whether we're talking about 6 types making up the primitive set or 12 types making up the primitive set.
Agreed. So if the question is that the pieces of work that I'm envisioning here are like 2-part. There's adding the 6 other types. I think that is reasonable, and I think we can arrive at a conclusion on that before the end of .NET 8 without too much problem. And then there's adding the 6 other types and retrofitting the whole thing so that it's fast. And I would maybe like split out the retrofitting so it's fast thing into a potentially later date. Like, I'm not saying we won't get to it, but I'm hoping that we could find some cutoff point where it's like, okay, it's trimmable. It's not fast, but it's trimmable. Does that make sense?
I mean, first and foremost, I'm focused on the API and making sure that the API we expose makes sense. We can make it faster and faster over time, but I don't want it to be a partial API that we expose. So, like, if we can expose the full API and it's just not as fast as we would like in some situations, that's fine. We can make it faster over time. But I'd be very hesitant in the name of everything you enumerated to make the API incomplete.
Okay. Is there a particular reason for that? I'm just wondering.
I think from a API perspective, a few things. One, it's very strange to have an API that says these are the primitives that are supported, even though they're not the primitives that are supported, right? It sends a very confusing message to a consumer of the API. The second is it doesn't actually address all of the trimming issues that you're trying to address with it. So it's a partial solution, because the moment someone does do daytime, they're going to get all the same problems. The moment someone does GUID, they're going to get all the same problems. Whereas if the API is complete, either it compiles and there are no warnings, or it would have blown up at runtime and you get a warning, right? So basically making the API fully solve the trimming problem, I think, versus only partially solving the trimming problem, there's a big difference between complete and not complete.
Okay.
And then secondarily, after you get past all the optics and all the confusion and all the trimming, safely versus not, there's also the aspect of it's a lot easier to take the thing and improve its performance over time than it is to iteratively add to it. And every time we iteratively add to it, ensure that everything we care about continues to work. We get all the we get the API in place, we get all the tests in place, and then we can iterate to our heart's content on the implementation and making sure it works well. At least that's my perspective.
I think that makes sense. I would one more point on that before we move on, which is like, let's say we forget something here or miss something. Is there any impediment to adding it later?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I don't know what breaking changes or whatever we might run into by being additive. I would hope the answer is it just works. We could add one more implicit operator and everything is fine. But that's something we need to answer regardless of the approach we take.
Right, because we could support more things in the future, right? So, like, I think that maybe is most important, because if we can evolve this, then it doesn't feel... I agree that, yeah, completeness and presenting a uniform approach is, like, really good, and that's what we would want to aim for. But it also feels like if we have a design which we're comfortable, like, yes, if we find something else, we can add it in the future.
Yeah, but
maybe...
when in terms of adding in the future, like, we have a list of things that internally are supported, that are internally considered known types, and I think when we ship a public API like this, the list of things that show up in this should match the list of things that's internally supported. If we wanted to add something else in the future, we'd add it both to that internal list and to this.
Agreed. Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
Okay, yeah.
There is the one consideration that implicit conversions for primitive types are different from implicit conversions for user-defined types. And there are many cases where if you don't expose the implicit conversions for these small types or for uint at the same time as you expose the implicit conversions for int and long, that the small types may still work and count as implicit conversions, but they'll pick the int overload or the long overload rather than the correct size. And that could potentially mean that this works with sbyte, but it ends up being interpreted as an int rather than as an sbyte, and suddenly changes the payload.
Right, that would be if we didn't expose all the primitives now. If we only exposed the ones in the original list, when we added the sbyte overload, we'd actually change how it was serialized.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
I am 100% okay with adding the rest of those things. It's just that I got a bunch of CLS compliance errors when I tried, so like I deleted them. That I just don't know what the rule is there. That private event source constructor is illegal.
We still annotate CLS compliance because corelib hasn't removed it. Jan tried to remove it a long time ago and hit problems. But the C# compiler does not correctly track CLS compliance anymore. Required initializing properties are technically not CLS compliant because they use modrec. We don't flag that as not CLS compliant. So like we still
the answer is just annotate. Okay.
Yeah, we annotate, but and we try and be consistent with the rest of the ecosystem. Like everything uses int, so int is our preferred return type and input type for most things. But we don't have a huge precedence on like it's not CLS compliant, so we can't expose it.
All right, so I think I got the list. The most interesting question is the last supported category of things, which is all enums. And so I think I captured that correctly with the generic.
I think you'd want struct, enum. That way it's limited to concrete enums and not boxed enums.
I didn't. Okay.
And notably, inuint. Inint is there as int pointer, but inuint is
Inuint is
missing.
not here.
Yeah.
Well, like that's adding
which
support to the type.
Yeah, which means it goes through string today.
What?
At the very bottom of this list, any types that aren't in that explicit list call toString. So inuint is supported, but it goes through toString today. Which is just an interesting aspect of
I
one
agree. This
primitive
whole
type
thing
is
was a
missing.
very enlightening walk through the source code.
So that's special. I mean, I guess we could add it so it captures correctly, and then
That I
it
don't
would
want to get into.
call
I'm not going to add
toString.
anything
But
to event provider that's not.
no.
already there.
I think he's saying don't add an implementation that serializes it correctly. I think he's saying add the implicit conversion that calls toString and saves it as a string.
Well, I would actually leave all those things for the object array because that's like literally everything else. Everything that's object should go through. Like it's not a primitive, right?
Yeah.
Like the purpose of this was to be these are the primitives. Anything else will go through the object array thing, and that's actually my intent. That like, okay, yes, all the things that are not well known are going to go through the object array thing.
Right, and that's why I was actually calling out Inuit is missing because it is a runtime primitive and now also a language primitive.
True, but I called this event source primitive for a very good reason, which is it is the things that are recognized by event source as primitives, not any of those other things.
But
I
I mean,
agree.
it's all the primitives,
so-
right?
so-
all the new primitives don't work here, or work the same way, right?
Right,
Like,
half.
in 128, half, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so
Date, time.
So the reason I call out Inuit in particular is the same reason I called out those implicit conversions earlier and how implicit conversions are special. Because Inuit is a runtime primitive and now also a language primitive, Inuit may end up working but calling the ulong overload. Because Inuit is always implicitly convertible to ulong.
Does will an implicit conversion as an input to a UDC to a params array still win over the boxing?
And that's what I don't know because there are some weird cases where the implicit conversions are allowed to basically double implicitly convert with the keywords, and I don't know if Inuit ends up being one of those cases. So if it is, then we need to explicitly declare it and then have it do the toString approach for consistency with how it's currently handled. And if it doesn't, then we should be fine. But I think it just needs to be tested.
So one
And
question
then-
I have is like, so is this then still an event source specific type, or is it just becoming, basically all language primitives we have effectively in the BCL? Because that's what it looks like right now. Like nothing about this type says event source, right? Except for the name.
Well, I think that's a pretty important thing.
Yeah, this is the set of types that event source recognizes, and only the set of types that event source recognizes.
Yeah.
So it is the union of the types that are recognized by event source. If there were a different component that was recognizing a set of types, it would be named after that type, and it would have the appropriate operators. I mean, we've had requests in the past for like, give us a general discriminated union for all, core primitive types. But our answer has been in looking over the consumers, the set of types that different systems support always varies just a little bit. And so we basically said, well, have a discriminated union that is specific to the subsystem. And that's exactly what this is.
Mm-hmm.
See, I would have bought that argument earlier when we literally only had 3 types in here, but now we're basically reverse engineering the entire set of the core primitive type. So that's kind of suggesting to me if we had that type, we would have just used that type.
No, but like there's no time span here, for example. There's no data only, there's no time only, there's no NUint. This is the set of types and only the set of types that event source supports.
Right, and if event source had special cased all the types off of the unified union at the beginning, that adding something to that union wouldn't automatically have given event source the right handling. They would have fallen down into a default case of either failure or success. And while I have the mic, chat asks if I meant a lowercase e or a capital E in the generic enum constraint. And I don't know the answer, so I'm asking the rest of you.
If you want to say system.enum, then it would be a capital E. If you want to say enum as a keyword, I don't know if it's legal there. I can't remember if we added that to the language or not.
So the answer is whatever compiles.
Okay. If the general
Yeah.
consensus is we've used the capital E, because I know that C# 2 added the very annoying warning, you cannot say the word enum here, because somebody didn't add it before the
Right. The specific thing I
version
don't remember
shipped.
is whether we just removed the warning or whether we actually added a specialty enum thing. Yeah.
We did
So-
not. So it's capital enum.
Okay.
And it works just like capital delegate does in that it constrains to anything that is that type or inherits from that type. And then if you want it specifically to be a non-boxed version, you do struct. And we didn't expose the lowercase enum, so that way we were free to have it mean something different in the future, such as struct, comma, enum, or also use it to say like only int32 enums or things like that. It was just left as a leave it open for the future.
Okay, except
there's-
I feel like the weirdness is the IL actually allows expressing the primitive enum instead of the system enum. But I will also ask while we're talking here, we've done a lot of stuff and we've said C#, and we did mention CLS compliance. Is having the two params overloads going to work with other first and second class languages? So F# is going to handle this fine, VB is going to handle this fine, COBOL.NET's going to handle this fine.
F# never handles overloads fine.
Okay.
It's always
F#
always
going to handle
generally
this
a
as well as it
breaking
handles
change
it?
So F#, it's usually a breaking change to add an overload, especially if one has not already existed. And so, but we do that all the time. So, so be it, right? VB, I think, should handle this fine. I don't remember any special details there.
Again, this comes back to my being just less certain about what happens when we have two paramses in the same method group. If we think it should just generally work in all of the
In VB, it should be fine.
CLR
it's just
languages.
param array, and like the overload resolution rules aren't quite the same, but I think this one should work fine.
And I guess if nothing else, if for some reason COBOL.NET prefers the object one over this one because it has different preference and binding order, they could force it by doing a explicit cast, however COBOL.NET would do that.
All languages have to have some way to like disambiguate overloads simply because that's how the language works.
Right,
Or
but
rather, that's how the system works.
But if COBOL.NET, just as a thing that we don't all have the domain expertise in, if it prefers the object array over the going through the user-defined conversion and finding the event source primitive array, then someone could coerce it into matching this better by casting each individual parameter.
Or calling
Or-
implicit operator because it's really a static method underneath.
Yeah, so they would have the ability to do this. It'll just look.
Yeah.
It may not look as slick as it does in C#.
It'll just be ugly. Yep.
Could we remove the params from the other method and then add an implicit conversion here for object and give a linker warning for just this one overload?
I don't. That would.
Removing the params object would break if they've passed in a type that wasn't on this list.
So that's what I'm saying. You imagine you add an implicit operator here for object and you put a linker warning of just this one conversion.
And any of the other, as we talked about, and any of the other implicit operators that weren't trimming safe.
Sure. But my point basically is just you can represent any types now.
But once again, that might not be the fast. Like, if we eventually want to make this fast, I would be very careful about adding things that couldn't be cheaply represented. Like, if you end up with objects in here that need to go through the whole serialization routine, do you now have to scan the whole thing, look for objects, do the serialization routine, go back, say, okay, well, I guess there were no objects, and now I'm going to allocate the array, and it's like, okay,
No, you just
now
make
it's no
a
longer fast.
Delayed
I'm not-
serialization wrapper or hidden wrapper type, and you save that as your custom box.
I'm also not super concerned. I mean, in the existing code, if you have something that's none of these types, you've just gone through like 20 if-else cases checking the type before you get to the point where you say, okay, this is an object, I'm going to do the object thing. Whereas here, if you've constructed this and it wraps an object, you just jumps the handling of that particular instance just jumps straight to the handling of object. Like you've already done at compile time. Well, I guess that's not entirely true. Someone could have cast object before constructing this.
Yeah, you could create an object array and then pass
Yeah.
it. Now, like this is an API. This is a generalized API design question that I would not probably want to get too far into. But it's like, okay, how would we? Do we want to support that? Like, is there a situation where we go down the path of saying, actually, this whole implicit object conversion and then toString, if it doesn't match at runtime, is kind of wonky. Maybe we want to obsolete the whole older overload thing. I don't know. Like, personally, the fact that sometimes the events just might not line up to what I expect is not a great user experience. So I probably wouldn't have designed this API the same way if I were coming at it completely clean.
I mean, what is the reason for params in the first place? I assume for object, I guess it was because we didn't have this type, right? Are people actually passing anything in here that isn't on that list? Do we really expect people to do that?
I didn't find any. So once again, like when I actually tried to pass a basic struct that wrapped like an int, I got an error from the debugger saying like your events aren't going to fire because this doesn't work.
I see.
So like that was surprising to me.
Yeah, if I had to guess, I think
that,
it's
like,
just
the only primitives are legal here.
Yeah,
Yeah, your mistake, Andy, was using a debugger. You just ship straight to production.
I mean,
but
I feel
just
like
yesterday I was playing with like Grafana and Prometheus, right? And like pretty much when you have like non-standard types, like nothing really is able to do anything useful with your metrics, right? So I assume these guys go somewhere, right? And then somebody else has to make sense of those, right? So it seems like you kind of want to.
I should mention going back to the like structure of, oh, is this primitive or this is event source primitive? The long-term thing here is that I would say all of these cases fall into basically serialization. And this presents kind of a long-term problem for trimming in the sense that, well, reflection-based serialization is a problem. So one thing I will say is I've built a third-party library that replicates Rust's SERDI library, and the idea is it does source generator stuff, but the other idea is that it splits the front end and the back end. So there's the front end, which has the source generator, which generates the serialization, and it's basically like iSerializable, except strongly typed. So it generates code that's like serialized field, serialized field, serialized field, passing the name, the value, and everything. But then the back end is like, it takes the serialized field calls, it implements serialized field, and then it does whatever it wants with it. So in the long term, I actually think that the right answer for a lot of these APIs is some sort of interface like that, where we get one source generator that we build once and ship to everybody. But then the back end, every time you have this small serialization problem, like event source or something like this, like the long tail of serialization problems, you implement just a back end for your little serialization problem, and then it's type safe and trim safe, and we walk away. So that's
that seems a bit heavy-handed here, right? Because I mean, it seems like there's this mini serialization, if you will, which is basically just toString, right? But that doesn't really do any sort of crazy gymnastics usually to give you a string. It either just gives you the type name or does whatever you implemented, right? So I assume toString is.
That's true for manifest based, but that's not true for the self-describing thing. If you go look at the self-describing thing, now you're.
So what is the self-describing thing?
It's the write overload that takes a T.
Oh, okay. Never mind then. Okay, so that seems like then your open-ended serialization. I just meant like for cases like here, like which is kind of like, I don't know, any sort of writer really, right? Where you just want to pass in all the primitives and then everything else is basically encoded as a string. That's like, quote unquote mini serialization, but like relatively well defined, I'd argue.
Totally. I think that one's fine. It's the case of like, eventually everything grows up to wanting to pass a struct, and
Right.
then as soon as you like a tuple, and then as soon as you're in that place, then you end up with all the serialization problems.
I agree.
And so like long term, I do think that it would be interesting to take, I mean, I think the answer is right now, I built an event source provider backed by Certi as a third-party library that's basically an abstract base class that inherits from event source, and it's like, oh, go implement mine, and then you can pass whatever you want, and it's fine. But if this long tail of stuff keeps popping up, then I might suggest that we like start thinking about whether we want to implement something like this in the framework.
But like, let's assume for a second you already had it, right, as a thought experiment. Would you then change this overload of write event to take in effectively a params of something that is serializable? Probably not. You still want some sort of simple
I would take
primitive
a
here.
params of T where T implements iSerializable. And then
Oh,
the
really?
source generator would be responsible for making sure that everything implements iSerializable. And then the back end just takes an iSerializable and shoves it into data. Like you can implement whatever format you want. The whole idea is you can easily swap out JSON for message pack, for literally writing into a data stream like event provider. That would be the idea.
I do have a small wrench to throw in the list of APIs here. I remembered that C# does not allow operators to be generic. So the enum one has to take
System.enum.
Yeah, just enum. This was an annoying thing we hit with generic math, and it's why we have create, checked, saturating, and truncating methods rather than operators of any kind.
But is that linker friendly now? Like, don't you just effectively now get a boxed value here?
Yeah, you'd get a boxed enum, and I'm not sure if that's friendly or not.
This might end up being annotated requires a reference code or something like
Yeah.
that. I don't know. I'd have to
Yeah.
think about it.
Bullet 2. If we need to, we add the attribute.
Yeah. And I think for Andy's earlier question on the params overload, that it sounds like if we were to want to obsolete it, it might be a good choice for the proposal that Jared had a while ago, but I think we ended up saying, like, let's see what needs it and where we would use it in the BCL of binary compat only, which basically means the member still exists, but it never shows up in IntelliSense, and the compiler basically won't even let you access it in new code, because it's only meant to be used for binary compatibility at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I mean, maybe once we have that, we would remove the member. I think the question would be, if we put the params on this one, can we remove the params from the other one and be content? And if we do it as defined right now, where we don't have the fallback to object, the answer would be no, because that would be a compile breaking change. It would help people, but we don't make changes that help people. We make changes that don't break people. So
It's a great tagline. We should put that one right up at the top of the .NET runtime.
Gonna go into my review this year.
Okay, so as a takeaway, like, let's say, so for me, I think the things are, go put the rest of the stuff in and annotate it as CLS non-compliant. That seems pretty straightforward. Chase down any trim-related issues that appear according to this list, and most importantly, like, get David and Noah in a room and force them to look at this API and be satisfied.
I mean, I think from the API review perspective, so these are going to require CLS compliant false, and our answer is when the compiler tells you have to add them, and we don't review those attributes. This one may require one of the trimmer attributes. The answer is if the trimmer tool tells you need the attribute, we don't care, add the attribute. And then from the shape, Andy, I think you said
That's illegal.
Is
It's
it?
struct. You
Struct,
can't make
so-
you can't
Because
make
it's a
the
struct, it's
constructor of a struct
illegal.
private.
Okay. That's fair. They could get default, and they can't get any other conversion. Yeah, okay. I was just making sure that nobody could do their own. That nobody could extend this list complicatedly, and they can't because there's no way to get at it. So, but there is.
Yeah, there is a private constructor there. It takes an object because right now the implementation for all this is to box it. But
really, it looks like that. It's not a.
it actually looks just like object. It literally just boxes whatever you put.
No. But
That's why I said
if
about
it gets implemented as the.
Yeah, then it'll probably be like byte.
No. But
16 or
the
something.
ref CS would say it has private object reference and private int value because it'll have a value type field and a reference field. So it will have the I contain references, so I can't be marshaled, or so I'm not blittable, and the I have a private, so I'm not definite assignment compatible. Like
Yeah, right.
I'm writing these in just so we generally don't here, and we let the ref CS deal with this. But I'm writing down that we intend it to have those semantics.
Yeah.
What happens if you pass it null?
It would probably go to the string one right now.
Wouldn't it be ambiguous between string and byte?
And enum,
Right.
if enum's not
I
value
actually
type.
think no. I think it would probably go to the object one, right? Because this one would be ambiguous, right?
If you pass in
I
the
think it might be.
literal null, yeah. So I guess we need to.
Open question. Good question.
I missed it. What was the question?
If you
What
have a
happens
null
if you pass
literal
a
in that
null?
argument list.
Do we
Oh.
care?
I mean, that might be a reasonable thing to say. We don't care because you're probably not passing in literals. You're probably passing in hopefully
You would have to be passing in
variables.
the literal null for this to
Yes.
really make a difference.
And so if
I assume if you pass in null, you end up blowing up at runtime anyway.
I assume
null
so
is
too,
not
but I haven't
supported.
checked.
Okay.
Interesting. So, but if that's the case, why do we take nullable types then?
Do we?
Nope,
Check
if
to see
data
if
is
the
null, it turns
API
it to the
takes
empty string.
Object
Null's a being
nullable
string
or
empty.
object non-nullable. Yeah,
Awesome.
but check to see if the API takes object nullable or object non-nullable. Because if it takes object non-nullable, then the answer is we shouldn't be taking null types.
Well, it seems like the code suggests that null is supported. It just becomes the empty string, right? So yeah, it says the array can't be null, but you can contain null values. So
wait, but this doesn't say param. Do you not render params?
I do not. I just found the bug. Apparently, there's an issue somewhere.
Okay.
I don't know why. I
right.
could have sworn that I did that.
So yes, apparently it says object question mark in the for the values in the array. So params object question mark array. Yeah.
I mean, it kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah. But so either the null literal is going to force it to go to object.
It makes it ambiguous.
But now we come back to in
Much
this
you care.
one case, do we really actually care? Like we
I mean,
do
I think in
allow
that
the
case it's fair.
occasional if you wrote the literal, like the word. I guess our general answer is if you wrote DEFAULT, we do not care what happens. And if you
Well,
wrote
I mean-
NULL, we usually say that should keep compiling.
So if it compiles with an ambiguity error, I think that's better than we just magically now bind to this overload. Because now you put in one null literal and your performance starts tanking. And that's not
Well,
that's not exactly intuitive.
We expect
right?
no perform. You would put in one null literal, and then you get the requires unreferenced code warning. And
Null
you'd be
would have
like,
been all.
why does null
No.
add unreferenced code?
There's that
Null
too.
was already ambiguous though because of the byte array overload. There's an overload that takes int.
That
on
would
the
be if
byte
you
array.
pass just a single null.
Yeah, if you pass multiple, then
And the nullability here would say that the null shouldn't have applied to this one. Not that it matters because null's just decoration, but the
Yeah, you
but
could
it'd
get a
be
warning for that now.
if you have
Would-
4 strings and one of them is null, like you're past the specific string thing, so you're hitting the params, and
Yeah.
it's like whatever, that's fine. But yeah,
Just change your code to passing string empty at that point, because that's what it does anyways.
Indeed. I think I'm personally okay with saying that the domain on this is so small, I can't imagine why anyone would be passing the literal null to the params right event. And if they get broken, then I will feel sorry for them when I eat lunch. That's the level of
It would
commitment
certainly
I'm
be
willing.
strange, given that this API is intended to be used as part of. You create some method that is a logging method, and the intent of this method is you're delegating from your wrapper to this, passing in the parameters to that containing
Right.
thing to this. So to be passing in an explicit null, you'd have to be manufacturing additional parameters beyond the ones that were provided to you, which would in and of itself be strange.
Well, I mean, I think
Actually,
the answer for that would
I
be
think that's illegal.
your manifest previously said you needed a value, you stopped accepting it, and so you're passing the null in its place.
Yeah, but I think that might be illegal. So,
Well, because the runtime will turn it just into the empty string.
So why
right,
would it
but
be
the
illegal?
the manifest checker, there's like something that validates that the manifest is correct based on what you have in the attribute. And so if you're taking, I suppose the idea is you're taking a parameter, but you're throwing it away and you're putting null in instead. Because there, I saw an error of like, hey, you're taking 3 parameters, but you're calling the API with like 2 parameters. That's not allowed.
No, this would be my evolution story is the other way. You used to take 6. You're keeping your manifest XML consistent across your version, but you've stopped accepting one of the parameters, so you're passing null into the manifest, saying we no longer collect this data.
Isn't the manifest dynamically generated based on these attributes?
I thought that was the if you call write instead of write event.
It's still dynamically generated.
Okay. Because I thought there was something somewhere where we could have the manifest being generated as a ETW pre-seeded manifest thing that you're matching against.
Maybe like there might be a way to like get it to spit out the XML and then save the XML somewhere and then load it in. I didn't see that in the code, but it's possible I missed it.
I thought that was the intent behind the write event, was the event scheme being defined somewhere else. But
I haven't seen anybody doing that. I've mostly seen people just write, subclassing event source, having new methods that, write event, et cetera, and then annotating them with the correct attribute and then calling the base.
Where'd it go? Over here.
They're all protected, right?
You can see a lot of examples in the PR actually of me like removing suppressions. Those are examples of places where we no longer need to suppress stuff.
Oh, this is the PR.
And use cases for how we actually use event source. This also revealed a fun bug where we run the linker, it seems like in multiple configurations. In one of the configurations, it's the live build. In another configuration, it's the previous. And the linker is configured such that if you have a suppression, but it's not suppressing anything, that's an error. But if you have a warning and it's not suppressing, that's an error. And so this is impossible to fix without changing the build because, we removed the warning, but not in the previous API, and therefore somebody's going to warn, and this is going to turn into an error.
Right. So like this is hitting it just
because it's got too many parameters.
the logic is the same. Sure. But yeah, so this is just it accepted more than 3 strings, so it hits the params case.
Yeah, but there are a lot of people who like hit it just because they accept one bool.
Yep.
And bool is not in the list, so.
Yeah, I remember when I was wiring up the logging for the certificate chain on Linux, going through this and finding, I think I tried logging a Boolean and it didn't show up in the event viewer manifest correctly, and so I'm like, fine, log the Boolean as a 0 or 1 int because that works. And so I know that there's a lot of this type is special.
So you're saying bool is not on the list today, but it would be in our new primitive, right?
Bool isn't, there's no overload that takes bool. So if
Today,
you
right?
try to pass a bool, it'll always go to the object overload immediately.
Yeah, and I may have
but
been using write instead of write event and may have been hitting a different set of problems, or it may have written it into the serial,
Yeah,
or it may
right,
have
you're not-
written it, but the viewer didn't support the Boolean type, and so I wanted a thing that the viewer supported. And
Yeah, so for write, you're not allowed to pass primitives. And
Oh,
for
okay.
write event, you're only allowed to pass primitives.
Cool, yay!
And the difference between them is that one is called write event and one is called write, but they're actually completely different systems.
Who wrote this?
It's just evolved, I think. Like the comment at the top of the page is just like, this is code that's been evolved for years and it's gotten kind of messy.
I think it was written by Vance initially and then changed over a few times. I think initially it was all based on reflection, and we moved away from that and then made it
Fair
more
enough.
performant.
Yeah, I mean, I know that the whole thing came about because Vista added the ETW stuff, which was
I
called
want to say at some
Crimson,
point.
because I worked on it,
Oh,
or I worked with it back when it was called Crimson. I'm old. All right, so I think shape-wise, we say for the shape that we're happy with this, and let the attributes fall out where they have to, right?
Yeah.
So this was every type that we saw the special handling for. We have the note from Tanner that new int. We need to find out what happens if you pass new int, because the intention is not to make breaking changes.
I already checked that. If you pass nuint, it'll map to the struct rather than to object.
And it calls the ulong overload?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, that's what I thought might happen.
So we can add an overload that
So we
explicitly
need to
does the thing.
add it so that we can handle it and force it to go to string.
Yeah.
And I believe that's the only thing that has language support, so probably the only thing that that we'll need to special case.
Yeah, I think all the other language primitives are here now.
And we are gonna take a breaking change in terms of null. That was my other takeaway.
I think that's
The
fine.
literal null.
A breaking, source breaking change.
Source breaking change.
Yeah. Passing a literal.
Which has a trivial workaround of specifying the type. Yeah.
I mean, presumably we accept nuint and nint, right?
Nint
Right now
is,
we say
Nint is
It
also
is
called
importer.
intpitter.
yeah, but like either way it's fine, right? It's the same outcome, right?
No, intpitter works, is handled. It's only they didn't handle uint ptr, so that called toString.
I think what you're asking, Emo, is does it matter whether we call it nint or intputter here?
Right, and I think
Yeah, it does not matter.
Yeah, no.
Yeah. it's just inconsistent
of-
note-taking.
As of C# 11 and .NET 7, it does not matter. In
I'll
.NET
make Tanner
6 and
happy.
prior, in .NET 6 and prior, there is a minor difference, but an identity conversion.
Right.
Yeah, and then chat says yes, you can generate the manifest XML and register it with WEVT util. So. I did remember something about Crimson. I don't know if I'm happy or sad about that. Alright, so I think we're ready to call this approved.
Out of curiosity, why don't we take daytime offset? Isn't that
It's
what
not
you
on the
would
list.
expect on the list?
We weren't
Yeah.
trying to change functionality. here's the list. It says datetime.
Yeah.
Vance
If
never added
the-
datetime offset.
Yeah, there's a few types that might be interesting to support moving forward, like time only, date only, date time offset, time span, int 128, uint 128, half. But those would all be separate proposals if we wanted to support them at all.
I think they wouldn't appear necessarily very likely in logging. Versus datetime offset is the type we tell people to use, especially when you cross client-server boundaries. So I would expect that to be very weird if the better type suddenly ends up being toString.
Yeah, I mean that may have been
Yeah,
one of
that's
the
already
cases
the
that I
case,
hit with my
right?
logging.
Yeah, no, I know that's the taste of it, but that seems fundamentally broken, right? Versus the people that actually deal. I mean, time only, maybe, date only, maybe, but they are more specialized. Time span as well doesn't seem super likely, but datetime offset seems kind of broken. I mean, numeric types going via toString is not efficient, but at least you get, sensible behavior out of it. Versus datetime offset toString probably didn't mean that.
So I think that my broader takeaway is just that's kind of why I would like us to think about heading the direction of the serialization framework approach, that these kinds of problems wouldn't be solved per library. They would kind of hopefully be solved once.
Yeah, that goes into the pile of famous last words, but yes.
Well, they would be centralized. They would actually, so you would have a more specific way of dealing with them rather than relitigating for every API.
Let's just say I buy the premise. I'm not sure it will hold up in all cases, right? Because you would still, even with that split, there might be like the order in which you traverse might not be what your serialization backend wants, right? So you might end up with some amount of duplication anyways, right?
It's certainly possible. And the other thing is just, my Xerte thing doesn't actually have built-in support for datetime or GUID. That's a wrapper. Like, just like custom types need a wrapper, this one would need a wrapper. I have a built-in wrapper for datetime that actually turns it into a string, the UTC string. But like, that would be, it's deliberately designed to kind of flush those problems and push them more towards the user, who is generally more equipped to deal with how they want things formatted, and less to us, where we have to decide, oh, we've decided there's like one way to format this, and we're going to force you to go through that. And it's like, but what if I didn't want it formatted that way?
Yeah, the bigger problem is right now the default toString is probably not what you want ever, right? Because it's basically whatever the current locale happens to be, right? So which is probably not what you want in your logs on the server.
Agreed.
I mean, you might be lucky if you're running it on a server. It's probably ENUS. It's probably UTC, right? So it's probably gonna not fuck you up too much, but still, if it happens on the client, probably not what you want.
All right. Any final words?
It's approved, right?
Assuming that David and Noah are okay with it.
Yeah. I guess David would just say, sure, it takes us 5 years to implement, but action.
I'll do all the implementation for them.
I've never heard David Wright ever say this is a bad idea.
This is David Mason, but yeah.
Oh, I see.
Hello? Hey, that convinced it.
Yeah, there's something weird on GitHub, like sometimes happen.
Womp. All right, thank you, Andy.
Thanks.
And does anyone believe that add a range attribute constructor supporting arbitrary I-comparable ranges 82526 is a 5-minute issue?
I think a different one from Steven is a 5-minute issue.
Yeah, I have 1 or 2 5-minute issues if you don't think this one is.
I don't
The
think this one is.
encoding try-get bytes.
Oh, I wasn't even thinking that one.
Give me a number.
I have a different one that's even faster.
Okay.
Ready to type a
But that
number.
one's also quick, to your point.
What's the number?
Give me 5 digits.
Can you go back to the .NET API review list on your first tab? It is the make regex runner.char in class public instead of protected. About halfway down the screen. Yeah.
All right.
So we currently have a protected method on this regex runner type, which is the type that is sort of the extensibility point for regex. And in the source generator right now, we want to access that method from a helper type that doesn't actually derive from regex runner. So into every assembly, we're having to emit this type derived from regex runner that creates a public method purely to delegate to the protected one. This is a type that no one cares about. No one uses this thing. It's buried away. And even if you did see this method, you wouldn't know what to do with it. I'm suggesting we just make it public instead of protected.
Yeah, that seems easy enough.
Yeah.
Like, there's
Since the
nothing
member
you can
already
do.
exists, there's no is char class
Yeah.
the right name. It's there, so we're just visibility. So yeah.
All I'm suggesting changing is the visibility.
So, according to the documentation, the doc says supports infrastructures not intended to be used by apps. Should we EV never it just to kind of make that more obvious?
I'm fine with that too. Pretty much every member on regex runner meets that category. Like I'd be totally fine putting it on
okay.
everything.
Yeah, that's why I
If-
don't care about it. Like Regex
Yeah, if-
Runner is infrastructure already, right?
Sure, that's fair. If people aren't really looking at regex runner for stuff, then sure, whatever.
I mean, I'd be fine putting it on the whole type. I think it's supposed to be hidden away.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't care about the EV never then if it's on this type.
Yeah, it seems weird to just add it to this one member.
Okay.
Because Regex Runner is the plumbing, right? That's
It
might
is
as well.
entirely plumbing.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
Looking at the members on this type, it's I don't think
Oh,
they
it's a fun place to look. Which actually gets us to the other issue that I think should be hopefully fast. If you go back to your list, Jeremy,
Working on it.
the obsoletes and protected members of regex runner. Yeah. So there is a ton of protected surface area on regex runner. And while we do use a large chunk of it, it was all introduced for the compile to assembly support on regex. This is the extensibility mechanism for plugging in. We also take advantage of some of it for the source generator, but there is functionality on there that the source generator doesn't use and will never use. There's some functionality that is a no-op, like that initialize references. It's an empty method. And then there's some functionality that I have no idea why it was even exposed because it was never used by compiled regexes. It's not used by the source generator. And we don't even use the format that it accepts anywhere, that char and set one at the bottom. So I'm just suggesting obsoleting all of these, and then ideally we'd be comfortable making that last method a throw new not supported exception, because I can't find any reference to it anywhere in the world.
Yeah, my only question is, do we know what compiled regexes look like with the old system?
Yeah, they don't use so obsolescence won't impact those, and it doesn't use any of the things on the bottom. It does use initialized references.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, no, obsolescence wouldn't, right? It's just that if you change the implementation, right, that would just potentially interfere with people that just basically reuse the .NET Framework generated ones on .NET Core.
Nothing here will break the assemblies generated with compile to assembly.
Yeah.
We have tests in place that exercise such assemblies to make sure that we don't break them.
We no longer produce them though, right? Do we support production via the
We
old
don't
system?
currently support producing them. If and when we got assemblybuilder.save, we could choose to, but we have also annotated compile to assembly as obsolete.
Right. No, I think that's fair. I think then we could potentially entirely remove them in the reference assembly as well, right? If we really expect nobody to use them. We really wanted to clean it up, right?
Yeah.
We would just leave it into implementation for backwards compat for the ones we know that are actually used. But if like giant set, for example, is never used, then well.
I mean, we get to decide if we want the missing method exception or that we just carry the extra overhead of the method that throws NSE. Missing method exception is always a pain to deal with.
Yeah, I suggest not removing anything that we know is used, right? It's just we would remove from the reference assembly set. So
right. Well, this is just because we never called this, if it was protected, somebody might call it. And while Steve can do things with, grep.app, he can't know every application everywhere that ever exists. So that's why if we delete the member altogether, that could cause a missing method exception from the one person in the universe who wanted it. But
given that they're all protected, I'm mentioning, I guess, and say they're like, if our infrastructure didn't use it, nobody else used it. Like there's like 3 people in the world.
Yep.
And I think for those, I would accept that as a consequence of life.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, if we're going to replace the body with this with not supported exception, or we're going to delete it outright, that's, I think, a thing that we would write down. So I marked this as breaking change. While I'm at the attribute of breaking change in the breaking change docs, we did mention that the Andy's issue would have a source breaking change for passing the null literal. Should we slap breaking change on that one and make the docs be written, or is that below our docs carrying threshold?
I would say it's the latter, because I'm pretty sure there's tons of API additions that have the exact same problem. It just doesn't occur to us.
Okay. All right.
Because basically every time you had an overload that is a reference type, like you have that problem, right? So, or potentially have that problem.
Yeah.
Which seems like that's the bar then.
Yeah, well, because I feel like generally we say if you had a thing that took a reference type and you could have sensibly passed null, then we do tend to get a little upset at adding an overload that, like, we've stopped and thought really hard about those cases. But if null wasn't supposed to work, then we didn't care. Like, if null was just going to throw an argument null exception, then we said we don't care.
And would you say sounds sensible? I'm just...
Yeah, I'm willing to believe we've missed cases where the null literal causes a compile break. But all right, so marking these as obsolete. I assume they're all obsolete false, except maybe this last one is obsolete true of we took the method away. If you see this warning, it's not going to work. But
yeah, I think that makes sense to me.
Okay.
By the way, like at some point we looked at Regex and considered changing the engine to something else for performance. Like with our source generation, do we still think there's something we could be doing, or do we think that we addressed that problem now?
We think we addressed the problem.
We did good today.
All right. I think I handled all of our routine. It's a syslib code. We talked about one being error, the rest being warning, and me explaining why I put breaking change on it. We happy?
One question for that if I do remove the body of char and set, thereby making it want to be a error instead of warning, what are our rules around using the same syslib code for things that are both, in some cases, warnings and in some cases errors? Do we care, or?
I don't think I care.
Okay. Then I would just use the same method, the same code for all of them.
Yeah, I think if it wasn't the literally no one should see this case that we're expecting, then it might make sense to have them different. But in this case, I think it's just we're giving you a stronger don't call this on this one.
Yeah.
And I assume as well, if I wanted to slap EB never on things, that'd be fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have a general policy about that? Do we generally say like things that we mark as obsolete should also get an EB never, or we hem and haw about it?
So the reason why I'm kind of indifferent on this, because it depends, right? The problem is if you suppress it because you want to keep using the technology for some reason, then if we basically hide all of the stuff, it becomes very difficult in IntelliSense to actually use it, right? Because it doesn't show up at code completion anymore. You actually have to type out the name manually, right? And that might be okay for cases where it's overload, so you're not really impacted by things, or for cases where we really don't expect anybody to use them, like here. But if it's like, oh yeah, you shouldn't use web requests anymore, we obsoleted it. I mean, if I want to keep using it for backwards compile, it would be nice if code completion keeps working, right?
Got it. So it's the degree to which we consider something obsolete. If there's no reason to use this ever, then fine. But if there's a possible reason,
yeah, like on things like, I'll just say assembly.load, right, where it could be we added a new overload of assembly.load that is way better, and we think no one should use this one. But if you're multi-targeting, you're obviously going to have to use the older one, and then having your IntelliSense be schizophrenic depending on which compile target the visualizer thinks it's in at the moment feels bad. But if it's no one should have ever called this, there's no alternative, just pretend it doesn't exist, seems fine to EB never it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way we should fix this in general is like, I would be more happy if the compiler would basically automatically hide it unless you start suppressing it, right?
Well, that'd
like
be an IntelliSense feature, and
yeah,
aren't you dating IntelliSense?
Sorry, what?
Aren't you dating IntelliSense, or does she own something else?
I don't understand the question, but like,
doesn't
all I'm saying is
own IntelliSense?
No, I think that's somebody in the I mean, it's basically a Roslyn feature, right? It's like whatever the language service reports, right? So I think the way this would work is you would say, if the obsolation would fire, then you would hide it from IntelliSense, and if it wouldn't because you suppressed it, then you would show it, right? I think that would be the way to do it. So then once you suppress it, you still have the same experience, so you don't get like weird behaviors.
Because I feel like IntelliSense shows obsoleted things in strike through, meaning it already understands special notion of that. So either IntelliSense could do the feature, or the compiler could just lie and tell them it's not there.
I think you're thinking of a product that is done by a third party. I don't think IntelliSense does strikeout font today.
Okay, I was really thinking back to the last time I called assembly.load, which probably would have been like 2007, which would be before I've ever maybe used some other third-party product.
Right. But that's another way to deal with it. I think de-emphasizing it in tooling, I think, is the right way to do it. I think the problem with the attributes is you're basically making decisions for the user, and that might not be always the right call, right? Versus these ones, I mean, that's also why I don't care about hiding them. Like, the only way you see them is if you derive from those types, which already puts you into the, you're weird category, right?
Yep.
It's more problem for if they were static members that you see by just dotting into it, or instance members that are public. So then, good for today.
All right, so I'll call that approved. And I think Steve was wrong about this one being a 5-minute issue.
It was 5 minutes to the point where we agreed, and then we pontificated.
I will accept this.
Thank you all.
Alrighty. So yeah, we got through a lot, even though one of them took like an hour and a half. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we will see you on Tuesday at our same .NET time on our same .NET channel. Auf Wiedersehen.